is a brand new adjunct instructor at the University of Central Florida in the Judaic Studies program, and I'm happy to tell you that I was at least partially responsible for his recruitment as the interim director of that program prior to my retirement. And it was my last contribution to the university, and I'm thrilled with the quality of person that we found for a very challenging position to teach the Hebrew courses to our students. Sandy earned his Bachelor of Science degree at Case Western Reserve University in the area of physics. Now that, one wouldn't think, relates directly to religion, but he took a circuitous path to his current, and we assume permanent, occupation as a rabbi. After his studies in physics, he earned a master's degree in business administration at Detroit University, and then went to work in the field in a number of different capacities, none related to religion. He had a calling, and that served, I presume, as his midlife crisis, and he went back to school, earning a master's degree at Gratz College in Jewish studies, and 2 days later was ordained as a rabbi. Sandy subsequently served at a very well-known synagogue in New Jersey as the director of lifelong learning. That was Temple Rishon, Beth Rishon, in Wyckoff, New Jersey. But he's ours now, here in Central Florida. We're delighted to have him. Please join me in welcoming our guest speaker today, Rabbi Sanford Olshansky.
Aaron, thank you very much, and thank you everybody for being here. I am a Reform rabbi. I'm a member of the most religiously liberal of the three major Jewish denominations, so I only wear a kippah, skull cap, for religious rituals and for religious study. I'm putting one on now because I'm going to be reciting a couple of verses from the Bible in the course of my talk. So today, what I'm intending to do is to give you just a taste of a very large subject that has really grown in interest in recent times. We're just going to scratch the surface, and this is how can religion and science coexist and possibly be harmonized or integrated. As many people believe today that they are separate disciplines, separate realms. That wasn't always the case. In traditional Judaism, there was a great desire, particularly in the Middle Ages, to harmonize religion with Greek philosophy, which was the science of that day. And in modern times, we've grown away from that. So I want to take you on a little trip into modern science, Jewish religious thought, and show how there can be some interesting intersections. Let's see how this first got to be on. Okay. Yeah, well, it should. Okay, all right. So we're going to start with Albert Einstein, and in the early years of the 20th century, Albert Einstein made what he later said was the greatest mistake of his scientific career. As he was developing his general theory of relativity, his calculations showed that the universe is expanding. And he didn't believe that. He accepted the standard model at the time of a static universe, which goes back to the Greek philosophers, Aristotle and Plato. And therefore, he added to his formulas for his general theory of relativity a fudge factor to give the appearance of a static universe. Next slide. Yeah. There we no, there we go. No, backwards. Wrong way. Okay, there we go. All right. In the 1920s, Edwin Hubble, for whom the Great Space Telescope of NASA is named, discovered that there was a red shift in the wavelength of starlight. And I'll explain that in a minute. And this shows that stars and galaxies are moving apart. This is similar to the Doppler effect for sound on Earth that is also used for radar and sonar to track the movement of objects. And from the fact that the universe is expanding and from the rate of expansion, we can calculate the date at which the universe began. The Doppler shift, as you encounter it in everyday life, is most obvious when a police car or an ambulance passes with its siren blaring. And as it moves toward us, the pitch rises. We've all experienced this. As it moves away from us, the pitch drops. The frequency of the sound drops. The lower pitch corresponds to a longer wavelength. For light, longer wavelength means a shift toward the red end of the visible light spectrum. So we call it a red shift. And what Edwin Hubble discovered in the 1920s is that the visible light emitted by stars is shifted toward the red end of the spectrum versus what would have been expected to be observed, and that indicated that the stars are moving away, that the stars are moving further apart, galaxies are moving further apart. This led to the development of the Big Bang Theory, which says that there was a creation event roughly 15 billion years ago, an explosion of energy from a tiny infinitesimal point, the size of an atom. And the initial result of this explosion was an expanding cloud of pure energy, which, as it cooled, led to the development of the first elementary particles, protons and neutrons. And with further cooling, as it expanded, and we know that as things expand, energy levels drop, and in this case, the cloud cooled, it was possible for the simplest chemical elements, hydrogen and helium, to form. The Big Bang Theory was confirmed in the 1960s by two scientists at Bell Labs in New Jersey, Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson. They used this huge horn antenna to discover that there is a background radiation throughout space, and the background temperature, the background radiation corresponds to a particular temperature. And this is characteristic of all emitted energy, whether it's the lights in this room, sunlight, or other forms of energy, X-rays. The wavelength corresponds the wavelength of the emitted energy corresponds to a particular temperature. And in this case, they found a very low temperature, 3 degrees Kelvin, 3 degrees above absolute zero. And that temperature matches the expectation based on the Big Bang Theory, going back to what the temperature would have been 15 billion years ago at the moment when energy began to be converted into the components of protons and neutrons. In recent years, as some of you who follow the latest discoveries in science may have read, protons and neutrons have been found to consist of smaller particles called quarks. So at the moment of quark confinement from this energy cloud, at the moment when energy turned into quarks, 1/1,000,000th of that temperature at that time is the temperature corresponding to the background radiation that Wilson and Penzias observed in the 1960s, and they got a Nobel Prize for it. And I want you to hang on to that 1/1,000,000th. It's going to be very important. So, we now have a problem. Religious believers have a problem. And this problem has been the subject of a lot of literature and writing, including the famous play Inherit the Wind, that the creation event in time, the fact that scientists can say that the universe had a beginning in time, suggests a creator. But we have a biblical creation narrative that says that the universe was created in 6 days. And biblical history, as portrayed famously in Inherit the Wind, if you take the ages of the people listed in the book of Genesis, and then the ages of people in subsequent books of the Bible, you get 5,774 years up to today. But the Big Bang Theory says it's been 15 billion years since the creation event. So how do we reconcile this? Judaism has not had fundamentalism for most of its history. For most of the history of Judaism, there have been multiple interpretations of the Bible. We only developed fundamentalism really in the last 200 years as a reaction to modernity, as a reaction to liberal thought and moral relativism. And people within the Jewish community who were scared of those things started to build up walls. Until that time, our sages, particularly our great medieval sages, were very open to a variety of interpretations of the Bible. If you ever looked at the Rabbinic Study Bible, you would see that in this collection of great medieval commentators, they disagree on the same page. Perfectly acceptable within Judaism. And therefore, you see these quotes, which I've been cautioned by Dr. Lieberman not to read, but you can read them. And there's one other from Moses Maimonides, our greatest medieval sage, greatest medieval genius of the Jewish people, who said that if the Bible and science appear to disagree, you're not interpreting the Bible correctly. So let's take a brief look at a couple verses from the Bible. And again, we're just scratching the surface of a very large subject. The first verse of Genesis, I'm going to quote it in Hebrew. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. And we have a number of translations on the screen here. The first one is the translation that most of us probably grew up with in both Jewish and Christian Bibles. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. It's a bad translation. It's a bad translation. The next one is a little closer. The second one is from the mainstream or middle of the road Bible published by the Jewish Publication Society of America when God began to create heaven and earth. The next one is from my favorite modern commentator, a professor at University of California in San Diego. In the beginning of God's creating the skies and the earth, but my favorite translation is in the beginning of blank, something, God created the heavens and the earth. And and I'll explain that, why that blank is there in a jiffy. Second verse of Genesis. V'ha'aretz hayta tohu vavohu v'choshech al pnei tehom v'ruach Elohim merachefet al pnei hamayim. Less disagreement about the translation of this one. The earth being unformed and void with darkness over the surface of the deep, and a wind from God, or God's Spirit, hovering over the water, over the face of the water. Our greatest medieval Bible commentator, Rabbi Solomon Yitzhaki, who we call Rashi, and his grandson, Rashbam, Rabbi Shlomo ben Meir, Shmuel ben Meir, wrote profound commentaries on these verses. The word Bereshit, the first word of the Bible, first word of the Hebrew Bible, the first word of the Christian Old Testament in its original Hebrew form, means in the beginning of something. In the Hebrew Bible, this sort of word is always a compound noun. It's part of a compact noun connected to another noun. Jews who are in the room may be familiar with Simchat Torah, the holiday in the autumn when we celebrate the completion of the reading of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, and start over. It's the same sort of compound noun. Bereshit is the kind of word that's always followed by another noun in the Bible. So Rashi said that if the Torah, and here I should explain, Torah in this context is referring to the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, or first 5 books of the Old Testament. In another context, it might refer to the totality of Jewish learning. But here it's referring to those 5 books. If the Torah meant to say in the very beginning of everything, it would have used a different word, Barishonah. But as both Rashi and Rashbam pointed out, this wasn't the beginning of everything, because verse 2 says the water was there already. It says the earth was unformed and void. So there was some material already in existence. And both of them concluded that the Torah, the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, and specifically the book of Genesis, is not trying to teach us the scientific facts of creation, but rather moral and spiritual lessons. And they left it there. That was fine for them. Not fine for the fundamentalists. Jewish fundamentalists and Christian fundamentalists, and I don't claim to be an expert on Christianity, want to believe that the text is the inerrant, perfect Word of God. Now, in Judaism, we can believe that the text is the Word of God, or inspired by God, or partially the Word of man and partially the Word of God, on different levels. Judaism has 4 distinct levels of interpretation of the Bible. A surface meaning, which we call peshat, a hint meaning that we call remez, a sermonic or homiletic meaning, which we call darash, which means a sermon or homily, and sod, secret meaning. And those 4 forms of interpretation have existed throughout Jewish history. So we don't feel a need to read it literally. The greatest conservative rabbi of the 20th century, Abraham Joshua Heschel, at the end of his life, wrote a book called Heavenly Torah that actually showed that throughout our history, sages believed that there were not only multiple ways to read the Pentateuch, but that it was not all the inerrant Word of God. Some of it was the Word of man, and some of it wasn't even written by Moses. But that's one point of view. What if we want to read it literally? What if we want to read it on a literal level? So there's a lot of the work in this field has been done by an MIT-trained physicist named Gerald Schroeder, who used to work for our Department of Defense in nuclear weapons testing, and became Orthodox and most traditional form of Judaism, and went to Israel and enrolled his kids in religious day school. And son came home one day and said, "Dad, how come they're telling me there that the universe is 5,700 some years old, but we're digging up fossils here in Israel. They're 50, 60, 70,000 years old. How can we make sense of that?" So he had to come up with an answer for his son. Schroeder believes that the Torah, the Pentateuch, is factually true, but as I believe, that it requires interpretation. As Maimonides believed, it requires interpretation. So here's a scientific interpretation. Schroeder applied Einstein's special theory of relativity, which says, among other things, that time is relative. Now, we all heard this in the movie Inherit the Wind, where the Clarence Darrow character, played by Spencer Tracy, famously says to the William Jennings Bryan character, played by Frederick March, "Well, what if it wasn't exactly a 24-hour day?" That's easy, that a day may have been relative. But let's take it a step further. Some of you may have encountered in reading or in formal studies Einstein's famous twin paradox, which says that if a man travels on a very fast spaceship while his twin brother or woman and twin sister remains on Earth, that the twin who returns will have aged less. It's a thought experiment, but it has been tested some years ago with high-precision atomic clocks that were flown on the Concorde jet airliner. And sure enough, there was a small difference in the elapsed time for the clock that had traveled at high speed on the Concorde versus the clock that was stationary on Earth. But there's an even better proof in nature, and that comes from mu mesons that form in our upper atmosphere when cosmic rays strike atmospheric gases. Now, this is not a picture of mu mesons. Mu mesons are subatomic particles. This is a picture of a meteor shower that I've picked off the internet to just as an illustration. And this is all good science that I'm talking here. Physicists have found that mu mesons, that in a sample of mu mesons, half of them decay every 1.5 microseconds. This is a subatomic particle that has a very short life. It takes 200 microseconds for mu mesons formed in the upper reaches of the atmosphere by cosmic rays striking atmospheric gases to fall to Earth. So if half of them decay every 1.5 microseconds, then in 200 microseconds, all of them just about should have decayed. But that's not the case. When we do the measurements, 1/8 of the mu mesons do reach the Earth. So if you do this calculation, half of them decay every 1.5 microseconds. For the if 1/8 are left on Earth, then for mu mesons, only 4.5 microseconds have elapsed, not 200 microseconds. This is significant because it's something that's moving very fast, and it shows how much disparity there can be in the elapsed time for two different observers, the observer on Earth and the observer riding on a mu meson, or the twin on the spaceship, or us traveling through space versus God. So 15 billion years for us, 6 days for God. God's frame of reference is stationary. Let's just say, for the sake of discussion, that God is beyond, outside and beyond the universe. This is one of the teachings of medieval Jewish mysticism. which said that God contracted. God did what's called in Hebrew tzimtzum. God contracted God's self in order to make room for the physical universe. That before the creation event, that God filled all of space, and God contracted to make room for us. Example of tzimtzum, Aaron likes this one. Cousin of mine who's divorced was preparing a video for the bar mitzvah celebration of his son, and family history video. He had a lot more in that video, a lot more material in that video than his ex had, and she became angry. And he asked me what I thought he should do about it, and I said, Brian, I think you should do tzimtzum. I think you should contract yourself and produce the video with an equal amount of material from our family side and from your ex's side. And that's what he did, for the sake of what we Jews call shalom bayit, peace in the house. So in the same sense as my cousin Brian contracted to make room for enough material from his wife's family, medieval Jewish mystics said that God contracted God's self to make room for the created universe. So God is stationary outside of the created universe. The early universe, as we know from science, from the Big Bang Theory, expanded at an extremely high speed. So time, according to what we've just shown with the mu mesons and with the atomic clocks traveling on the Concorde, passed very slowly for the parts of the universe that were in motion relative to God's stationary frame of reference. 6 days, turns out, you can do the math on the calculator on your pocket phone, turns out to be 1/trillionth, approximately, of 15 billion years. And it just so happens that the background temperature corresponding to the radiation observed by Wilson and Penzias in the 1960s, the temperature corresponding to that background radiation, as I mentioned earlier, hang on to it, 1/trillionth of the temperature after the Big Bang. Coincidence? Maybe, but pretty striking. Let's talk a little bit about Jewish mysticism. Many of you have heard the term Kabbalah. It means the receiving. It refers to a tradition that has been passed on supposedly since Abraham, certainly since the Middle Ages and perhaps before. It reached its peak in the Middle Ages and is supposed to be taught only to people over 40 who are thoroughly versed in Jewish religious studies before they ever begin to look at Kabbalah. That's been violated a lot these days. Kabbalah seeks a reality beyond what we perceive with our senses. It has created new models, various models of how God interacts with the world. And this is a graphical representation of one of those models, which says that God has 10 emanations. In Hebrew, they're called sphirot, 10 emanations of ways that God interacts with the world. And there's a whole lore about these and the various characteristics that each of them represents. And Kabbalah, among its topics, has a spiritual model for the creation of the physical universe. So let's see what the Kabbalists had to say. Nachmanides, Rabbi Moses ben Nachman, Moses son of Nachman, in Spain in the 13th century, roughly 100 years after Maimonides, talked about how in the beginning God created a very thin substance having essentially no mass. And if we think about Einstein's theory of relativity, that energy and matter are equivalent and can transform from one to the other, back and forth, in a particular ratio, the famous formula equals mc squared. This is close to what the Big Bang Theory talks about, that initially there was a cloud of pure energy. And as it expanded and as the temperature dropped, as the prevailing energy level dropped, the first protons and neutrons could form. Prior to that, there were just quarks that were going back and forth between energy and matter. And cooled to this is science I'm quoting now. Cooled to form protons and neutrons. Seems like Nachmanides is talking about something very similar. I'm not going to read the whole quote to you. You can read it well. That there was this very thin ethereal substance from which everything else was formed. Now we go to 100 years later, Kabbalah. The Zohar, the main book of Kabbalah from 14th century Spain, talking about an explosion of an infinitesimal point in space from which all energy and matter then emanated. Where'd they get this? How did these mystics, Nachmanides and the author of the Zohar, who many of us believe was a Spanish rabbi named Moses de Leon, where'd they get this? Without Wilson and Penzias's horn antenna, and without Hubble's 100-inch telescope. So there's one more aspect that we need to look at. And this has been written about a lot in recent years, something called the anthropic principle. A finely tuned universe. Does the universe that we experience, bless you, represent God's plan? The anthropic principle says that conditions on Earth are uniquely suited to human life. That, and it cites hundreds of relevant parameters, including the relative concentration of the chemical elements, the oxygen and nitrogen in our atmosphere, the gravity, the climate, the shielding from solar flares, from ultraviolet radiation, all the things that we need to exist. And we know from science that if some of these things were changed only slightly, we could not exist. Let's go back to the early universe. I'm going to borrow a phrase from Tom Wolfe, the right stuff. The Big Bang Theory, among other things, and modern cosmology more broadly than the Big Bang Theory, says that in order to get the chemical elements of life, there had to be fusion in the cores of stars, in these solar furnaces. Remember, we talked in the beginning about just hydrogen and helium being formed in the immediate aftermath of the Big Bang. And the hydrogen and helium formed clouds of gas which coalesced to form stars. Again, I'm talking science now, not religion. This is right out of the science books. And in these solar furnaces, these blazing hot solar furnaces, fusion took place, which created the other chemical elements, the heavier chemical elements. Fusion of nuclei of hydrogen and helium to form the heavier elements such as oxygen, nitrogen, carbon, silicon, and so forth, and iron, and all the materials that are needed for life. These stars, over billions of years, burn themselves out, and there were explosions, supernova, which is a term that most of you have heard, that cast these materials out into space. Eventually, they coalesced, and new stars were formed. And the process began again. The age of a star might have been, let's say, 5 billion years. There could have been 3 of these cycles. We could be in the 3rd such cycle. And in order to get the materials needed for us, you had to have these cycles, so these heavier these heavier elements could form and show up in the right place. We may have needed 15 billion years to develop the right stuff. There's an old story of one of the great Hasidic rabbis who used to carry 2 notes in the pocket of his long black coat. One note said, "I am but dust and ashes," and the other note said, "The universe was created for me." Think about it. We are stardust, as Carl Sagan says, vital dust, the title of one of his books. We're stardust. And according to the anthropic principle, the universe was created for us because it took that long for the materials that were needed to make us, to develop and show up in the right place. We are but dust and ashes. The universe was created for us. What does all this prove? I'm not claiming that this is conclusive evidence for the existence of God, or to prove that religion and science are definitely compatible. What I'm asking you today, and whenever I talk about this, is not to assume automatically that they're incompatible. Be open, as one of the quotes from one of the medieval rabbis said, to reading with new eyes, to looking at the Bible with new eyes, to looking at science with new eyes, and seeing possibly that the hand of God may be in the science. There's a lot of questions that remain that science has not yet answered, and that maybe science alone cannot answer. What caused the Big Bang? What came before? And how is it that the Big Bang occurred with just the right amount of energy, and that just the right combination of helium and hydrogen resulted from that explosion? If the proportions were different, the universe as it exists would not have come about. Why do conditions on Earth conform to this specific set of parameters, very complex parameters that science has discovered? In the 1950s, there was a famous experiment by a biologist who put a soup of chemicals in a glass vessel and exposed it to artificial lightning, and proved or demonstrated that amino acids, the basic building blocks of life, could be created by exposing this chemical soup to artificial lightning. And scientists loved it. Well, we didn't. Secular atheist scientists loved it. Well, we didn't need God, because the amino acids, the building blocks of life, could be created from lightning in the primordial earth upon the oceans. But what caused those amino acids to come together to form the first living organisms? And the definition of life that I learned in high school biology ages ago was something that can reproduce itself. What caused the amino acids to come together into something that could reproduce itself? How do we explain the gaps in the fossil record of the evolutionary changes in animals? One of the things that Dr. Schroeder mentions in his second book, and I'm going to put up the titles of his books in a jiffy. One of the things that he devotes a lot of space to in his second book, which is called The Science of God, is that we don't see a clear evolutionary path between classes of animals. Yes, we see evolution between species, as Darwin famously documented, but we don't necessarily see evolution from, let's say, sponges to mollusks to vertebrate animals with a backbone. There are gaps. And we also see that some evolutionary changes that should have taken a long time occur more quickly. And I would add to that that one of the things that Dr. Schroeder mentions in his second book is that life on Earth emerged earlier than it should have, according to many scientists. If the Earth is 5 billion years old, the first life emerged 4.5 billion years ago. The first simple living things. Seems like it would have been too fast to happen at random. And finally, and we could add a lot more questions to this list, but finally on my list, when and how did human consciousness begin? It's one thing to have animals that can reproduce themselves, but animals that are sentient, aware of their own existence, aware of their own limited lifespans. When did that come about and how? Why does this matter? It matters to me because in modern times, religion has been discredited, and science has become the test of ultimate truth. And religious believers are looked down on in many quarters. People who believe that the Bible is somehow an accurate record of God's interaction with humanity, or humanity's inspiration by God, are thought to be backward in some respect. Belief in God as the creator of the universe is central to Judaism and to Christianity, and the authority for the commandments and the principles that both of these faiths teach is believed to come from God. So we want to believe that, as the Bible says, we were created intentionally for a good purpose. The Bible says that creation is good, that the universe is inherently good. That's a religious statement, not a scientific one. But in order for this to be widely accepted, in order for the critics to soften their tone a bit, I think we need to show that there can be greater harmony between religion and science. I want to close this, well, I'm going to show you the books that I would recommend for follow-up reading. Genesis and the Big Bang, which was published by Dr. Schroeder in 1990, Science of God, 1997, and a book about Kabbalah by one of the greatest living scholars of Kabbalah, Professor Daniel Matt, called God and the Big Bang. Dr. Lieberman is going to show you a sign-up list. Anybody who wants to receive a list for follow-up reading and some quotes by email and an article on this topic by one of my teachers, I'll be glad to send them to you. And now, I want to close with a true story, about 100 years old. Emerson Hall, the headquarters of the philosophy department at Harvard, was, I think, being built, possibly rebuilt, and the philosophy department decided, well, we need an inscription for the facade of the building. What shall we put up there? And the philosophy faculty got together and discussed it, and they voted, and they said, well, let's put up, man is the measure of all things. And school year ended, they went away on their summer vacations, and the workmen who were assigned to do the work didn't like that very much. So instead, they put up a phrase from Psalm 8, a verse from Psalm 8. God, what is man that you are mindful of him? And that's there to this day on the facade of Emerson Hall at Harvard.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Olshansky. The first time my wife and I heard Sandy speak, after he finished, my wife turned to me and she said, "What did you learn?" I said, "Sim Sum." And she said, "What does that mean to you?" And I said very simply, "Yes, my dear." Well, as we do at all Lunch and Learn sessions, we now have an opportunity for questions. And as Sandy has indicated, I have a blank sheet here for anyone who would like to ask him questions. I'm going to place it, or answer questions for them. I'm going to place it right up here for you. And if you'll just leave your name and your email address, he'll be more than happy to respond.
I've got to pick up on two things, on one thing that you said, Aaron. I do a fair number of weddings as a rabbi, and I tell couples I'm going to marry about interviews that took place years ago in New York. One of the radio stations was going around and asking people who looked like they were old enough to have been married a long time, are you happily married, and if so, what's your secret? So they stopped one guy who said he'd been married for 40 years, and he said, you just have to remember 3 little words. You're right, dear. And I told this to a fellow rabbi who serves in Brevard County, where I live, and he said, I know, I married Miss Wright, and her first name is always.
Thank you. Any questions, please?
Yes, sure. And again, I'll be glad to send a reading list by email. Anyone who wants to sign up, there's 3 things I would send you: is reading list, some quotations from the medieval rabbis, and an article by one of my teachers that was published in Conservative Judaism magazine that talks about these books, a critique of these books, because I don't want to represent that I believe everything that Schroeder said. He does take some liberties, and there are some inconsistencies. I even myself took a couple of the quotes out of context, the Kabbalah quotes out of context. If you look at the larger context of the Kabbalah quotes, you'll see that there are things in the body of the text that do not agree with modern science. But still, it's amazing to me and amazing to my teacher, Dr. Levin, who wrote the critique, how much the Kabbalists got right, and how is it possible that what they believed was so close to what modern science has discovered. Other questions?
Rabbi?
Yes.
Some people talk as if there was either creation or there was evolution. To me, that misses it. I think God was perfectly capable of setting evolution in motion. And that's just me. I also have one comment. To me, as somebody raised in the Christian tradition, by far the greatest contribution of what we call the Old Testament was the concept of one God, that the universe was not put together by a committee. So.
Yeah, and let me just add to your comment that while I believe in evolution, I believe the scientific evidence for evolution within species, it seems to me, as it does to Dr. Schroeder, if you read his books, that God had a hand in evolution somewhere along the way, because there are gaps in the record, and there are things that appear to defy science, or appear to go beyond what science is able to explain. And that may be a very controversial statement to say that God had a hand in evolution, but so far science has not been able to explain some of the things that exist in the fossil record, and particularly some of the things that don't exist in the fossil record. And there is a discussion in Schroeder's second book, The Science of God, about some discoveries that were suppressed for a very long time, particularly about how early certain forms of life emerged versus what had been the expectation of science.
My question is it possible that both science and religion have it wrong? I just saw something last week that pointed out that some scientists believe there was no beginning. And then I saw another article in which scientists have initial proof that there were numerous universes or multiverses. So it seems to me that accidental, spontaneous universes doesn't seem to leave a lot of room for a God.
That's a great question. And again, I'm not trying to say that what I put up and presented to you today is conclusive. And yes, there is a theory of what's called oscillating universes. There's another theory of parallel universes, that our universe is not the only universe, either that there are other universes in existence at the same time with different conditions, or that there have been other universes that were not successful. And that is a possibility. That's not the standard model that most scientists accept today. Most scientists at the moment, we know science is always changing, but most scientists at the moment accept the Big Bang theory, and they're at a loss to explain what caused the Big Bang. I should also mention, with regard to other universes, that some of our Jewish mystics did think or claim that God had a number of do-overs, and that we are not the first creation, and that just as we see a do-over in the flood story in the book of Genesis, that there were do-overs on an even grander scale. That's according to the mystics. I have no evidence for this.
I noticed when Einstein discovered there were incongruities in his theory of relativity, in his fudge theory, it seems to me he came up with a deeper mystery than he had already solved in the theory of time, in relativity. And I noticed recently that Stephen Hawking has noticed an incongruity in his Big Bang theory, and that he is working hard to discover how that incongruity can be resolved. Also, recently, underneath Switzerland and France, they had this big accelerator that broke apart the protons and neutrons and discovered the God particle.
Yes.
And it disappears very fast so that you can hardly find it. And it just seems to me there's so many mysteries about it, and that even the Bible contains many incongruities. Perhaps we need to begin to look into the incongruities in life.
I agree with you, madam. And Jewish tradition agrees with you, which is why Jewish tradition has taught that the Bible should be understood and interpreted on at least 4 levels: the surface meaning, the hints, the homiletic or sermonic meaning, and the secret meaning. As far as Professor Hawking, I have not read his books. I want to. They're on my reading pile. He doesn't want to need a God, from what I understand from secondary sources. He wants to be able to explain everything without God, as many scientists do. There's another very great scientist, Steven Weinberg, a Nobel laureate physicist, who's written a book on the Big Bang theory called The First 3 Minutes, brilliant scientist, again, wants to be able to explain everything without God. And I intend on reading that also. That's on my suggested reading list I'll be sending to you all. My favorite seminary professor, and as Aaron mentioned, I'm a second career rabbi. I keep encountering things in my religious studies that I want to read, and my reading pile is growing faster than I'm taking things off it. My favorite seminary professor, who's in his late 80s now, says that he hopes that the Almighty has a well-stocked library so he can read in the next life what he didn't get to in this one.
When you die, do you vanish, or is there in fact God out there, surrounded by all the other people who died before you?
That's a great question. Judaism appears to have adopted in the last century or two before the Common Era the idea of an immortal soul. The Pharisees, who were the predecessors of both the early rabbis and the early Christians, felt that they had to believe in an immortal soul in order to balance the scales of justice. The early rabbis threw up their hands and said, it's beyond our power to explain the comfortable lives of some wicked people and the suffering of many righteous people. So they concluded that there must be a next life in which the righteous are rewarded and the wicked are punished. And the majority opinion of Judaism down through the centuries has been, I need to add this, that the righteous people of all nations have a stake in that world to come, have a place in the world to come. I believe that somehow our consciousness continues. How? I don't know. We haven't gotten any messages back. There are people who claim to have had near-death experiences and have related some of what they believe they observed, but that's my belief, and I think it's the majority Jewish belief that somehow our consciousness continues in some way.
With all of the interest that we've heard today about the origin of the universe, have there been scientific studies on the extinction of the universe, and when will that occur?
All right, that's a great question. There are some observations that say that the rate of expansion of the universe is increasing. That the rate of expansion of the universe is not constant, but it's accelerating, and that could be a bad thing. And this suggests that there may be dark matter in the universe, or dark energy that we're just beginning to learn about, that's causing this acceleration. I think that there is in the literature predictions for the life of our sun, a couple billion years from now. It's not going to be a direct concern to any of us in this room, but stars do burn themselves out. However, new stars form from the debris, as scientists have documented. How long will this process continue? We don't know. Will the universe continue to expand, or will it collapse in on itself, which goes back to the theory of oscillating universes, repetitive cycles that the gentleman over by the window touched on? Perhaps. I think cosmology still has a lot to learn about that.
Rabbi Olshansky, thank you so much for coming and being with us
Welcome.
today.
Welcome.